Denis CYPLENKOV has some of the most gnarly forearms in history. Of course, Denis's entire arm is pretty insane. For a long time, he had the world record in both strict back pressure and the strict curl. But because of how insane Denis's biceps are, sometimes people forget how insanely strong his wrist flexors are as well. But how did Denis train his forearms to reach the level he is today? What were the primary exercises he used? In this video, we will look at some of Denis's training methods for his forearms, as well as explaining why Denis's forearms are more active than the average arm wrestler during table time. Firstly, let's take a look at Denis's forearm training in the gym. One of the things about Denis is that throughout his career, he had a pretty major imbalance between his elbow flexor and his wrist flexor. Denis was never all that concerned about losing his elbow flexor, but losing his wrist flexor was a major concern. Because of this, we saw Denis incorporating more and more cupping exercises as time went on. Therefore, let's take a look at the only exercise that Denis uses for arm wrestling, clearly contributing to 100% of his success: nunchucks. This is the only exercise that matters for arm wrestling, and anyone who says different is to be banished from the arm wrestling community. But we can still take a look at some other exercises if you guys want, just for fun. One of the classic exercises for training your wrist is the infamous Mazurenko cupping handle. This is a lift we've seen over and over again from many different arm wrestlers over the years. It's a pretty good standard for measuring cupping across the board. When Denis first received this handle from Igor Mazurenko, his cupping numbers were honestly pretty unimpressive. Upon first trying this handle, Denis ends up lifting 40 kilos relatively easy. He goes on to attempt a heavier lift from here, but he ends up failing this lift. Denis continues to train on this handle and improve his numbers in preparation for his match with Devin Larratt. According to Igor's measurements, Denis ends up improving his numbers on this lift by around 20% throughout this time period. And of course, this lift is going to do a huge amount in terms of overall forearm development. This lift puts far more torque on your wrist than a standard wrist curl. With a normal wrist curl, the bar is only slightly offset from alignment with your wrist. Whereas with the Mazurenko handle, the bar is hugely offset from alignment with your wrist. This is due to the shape of the handle and the attachment point to the cable. If that made no sense, the point is that wrist curling 50 kilos on this handle is way harder than wrist curling 50 kilos with a normal dumbbell handle. So using this handle likely accounts for a decent amount of Denis's forearm gains. And we were able to see how effective this was when Denis pulled Devin Larratt later in that same year. Not only was Denis able to beat Devin, but we specifically saw the strength of Denis's wrist shine. Denis was able to force Devin into a hook in every single round with ease. Denis's wrist flexor strength and size had a noticeable increase. Now later on, we saw quite a bit more traditional wrist flexor training from Denis. Here we see Denis training with a lot of different handles that are more traditional movements. We see Denis doing a high pulley exercise with a fat handle, we see him using a wrist wrench with no strap, and we also see him doing wrist curls from a side pressure vector. However, he is isolating his wrist by blocking with a bench. This particular exercise is one of my favorite for isolating wrist flexion in a vector that is applicable to arm wrestling. All of the exercises shown here will certainly do a lot in terms of building up your forearms. However, this is still likely not the primary reason for the mass of Denis's forearms. I think the primary reason for Denis's massive forearms is a reason that is unique to Denis. Know that this next part of the video is pretty much entirely theoretical, and I haven't heard Denis address this subject before directly, so take it for what it's worth. That being said, I think the primary reason for Denis's forearm has more to do with his table time. More specifically, the combination of his table time structure and technique. Everyone knows at this point that Denis has some of the thickest hands in the world. He has literal catcher's mitts attached to his arms. The thickness of Denis's hands automatically causes his opponent's back pressure to apply far more torque on his wrist than it would if he had normal size hands. This means that Denis's wrist flexor always has to work harder than most other people. So whenever Denis is sparring on the table, just like any other arm wrestler, his forearm is being taxed to a higher degree than that other arm wrestler. This means that throughout Denis's entire career, his wrist flexor has always had to work extra hard in order for Denis to bend his wrist. He has always been at a significant disadvantage when trying to get his wrist to cup. Now, Denis could have decided to pull using a style that avoided bending his wrist. If he did this, perhaps he would not have gotten near the total volume to his wrist flexor that he did. maybe his forearms would not be nearly as developed as they are today. But Denis did not decide to do this. He didn't avoid his weakness. Instead, he acted as if it didn't exist. For the vast majority of Denis's career, we saw him holding on to his opponents and attempting to bend his wrist. Here against John Brzenk, we see Denis trying to wrist curl John's top roll and failing, but he doesn't really change his style that much going forward. Again, when Denis rematches John, we still see him trying to wrist curl John's top roll chain and we get the same result. But Denis still does not change his style. He decides to stick with the anthem of arm wrestling. Just do the same thing, but try even harder. The next time John and Denis meet, Denis was able to wrist curl John's entire top roll chain. Of course, once Denis bent his wrist and gained access to his power, it was an easy day. But the point is that all of those matches with John and every practice Denis had during that time all contributed to his forearm strength and size because of the style Denis was pulling in. Denis was pretty much always doing wrist curls with his opponents. Later on against Dave Chafee, we see Denis continuing with the same strategy of holding on and attempting to bend his wrist, indicating that his training and table time reflect this strategy. Although this task was extremely difficult and this match is an all-out war, Denis is eventually able to take the win. And throughout this entire match, he never stops trying to curl his wrist. It's difficult to think of a more effective training stimulus than letting Dave Chafee hit as hard as he can into you and trying to wrist curl him back in. Years later in Denis's more recent sparring sessions, we see more of the exact same thing. Denis is opting for the low grip and basing his style around getting his wrist bent. We often see Denis surrendering other pressures like side pressure for example, but we pretty much never see Denis allow his wrist to go back. Wrist flexion is something he always focuses on. The point of all this is to say that traditional wrist flexion exercises definitely will help develop the musculature in your forearm. And of course, Denis implements all of these exercises as we saw earlier. However, perhaps the most effective training for your wrist flexor is to base your entire arm wrestling style around that muscle, and then do a bunch of table time. Denis's style for the majority of his career was exactly this. Denis's wrist flexor may have had more volume, more maximal stress, and more failure than any other muscle in his entire arm wrestling chain. Of course, Denis's biceps are also very active, but there is a difference. Denis's biceps are not normally the weakest link in the chain. Denis was often in matches where his bicep was chilling at 70% max effort, but his wrist flexor was absolutely redlining just to move an inch. And I think this reason may be the primary reason for Denis's insane forearms. It is also worth noting that Denis did used to compete in strongman, which tends to be pretty taxing on your grip, so he would have had a good base before even training specifically for arm wrestling. But in the end, I think structuring your table time to emphasize your wrist flexor could be one of the most important aspects of forearm training. I would not recommend doing this if your goal in the sport is longevity, but perhaps if your main goal is to get massive forearms, your best option might be to ignore everything Devin Larratt has ever said and hold on to your opponent like your life depends on it.